Good evening and welcome everyone to Book Club. So as you can see, we have not one but two fabulous authors to talk about two fantastic books. So we have At the Edge of the Orchard by Tracy Chevalier and Around the World in 80 Trees by Jonathan Drori. So and we're going to hear more about those books and the authors very shortly. So I've loved reading and looking through both these books. So I'm really looking forward to this evening. And both you'll know, if you've read them, both of the books have a link to one of our sites in North Wales. The Charles Acker's Redwood Grove is referenced in both books, but lots of other and fascinating aspects to go through. So I'm going to now hand over to Wendy to just sort of set us up, and then we'll hand over to our authors.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So just a couple of observations from me, because I too have enjoyed both. I read this one first, and then I read Jonathan's, very different books. And I think that actually in their own ways, both raise a couple of the issues that we all sort of consider these days. And that, of course, is climate change and how plants will respond to that. So assisted plant migration and the global trade in trees. And Tracy's has obviously shown we've got apple trees move out of England and elsewhere, presumably to America. You have the amazing character of Johnny Appleseed, who I gather every American kid knows about, but very few English kids will know about, or British kids will know about. And then you have those incredible seed hunters, the Victorian seed hunters, working with huge ingenuity to bring back species which were very, very exotic to UK and Europe, things that we've never seen, like the redwoods. And as Chris has already mentioned, that has quite a resonance for us with the coast redwoods in the middle of Wales at Leighton. And then Jonathan's book is a treasure trove. And of the 80 books, the first three just really illustrate that thing about how humans have changed treescapes, I think. So the first book that you mentioned, Jonathan, was The London Plane, and that itself is a hybrid, a very vigorous hybrid. And that's because the American sycamore then met the Oriental plane, I believe. I hope I've got this right. Then you have the leyland cypress, or the Leylandii, which some people may love and some people may hate, but it was actually created not very far from the same woodlands I've already mentioned, the same woodlands that the RFS owns. And that was when a hardy yellow cedar from Oregon met a Monterey cypress. They would perhaps not have met had they not been introduced to one another artificially, if you like. And then, absolutely charmingly, I thought, the third book that you mentioned is The Strawberry Tree, native to the Mediterranean, but has been hanging around in Southwest Ireland for thousands of years, perhaps 10,000 since BC. So that again is the early migration of trees. And I find all of that absolutely fascinating. However, that's my observations, and I'm now going to hand over to the two of you to talk about your own inspirations and the themes that came up for you as you were researching. So over to you. And just before I go over to you, just to say at some point I will cut in to allow us times for questions. And if everybody wants to put in their questions in the Q&A, please do so. And when that time comes, we'll let you know.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for having us. Second, what we've been asked to do, I think, is we'll talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then have lots of time for questions. But if it gets dull, please interrupt us, or at least interrupt me, and then that's fine.
And I'm just going to interrupt you, because we're going to do a lot of that on this sofa. Just to say, Wendy, I loved your slip of tongue. You were calling all the trees John was talking about books. That was.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So sorry, everybody. I hope you could understand my wording.
I think it just sums it all up. It's wonderful. Yes, books, trees. That's what we're all about. Sorry.
Indeed, in most European languages, the word for the beech tree actually is cognate with the word book, buch and buche. in most European languages are the same, because books used to be made out of beech boards. But anyway, that's another story. So when you asked us to weave in genetic biodiversity and plant health movement and pest and diseases and so on, Tracy visibly blanched. But then
I'm just a novelist.
then we realised that actually those themes do occur in both our books. We've if you could see around us, we've spread out almost every desk lamp that we own here down in Dorset, and we've also had to negotiate with the cat, hoping that she stays out the way. So what could possibly go wrong? We're going to talk for a bit, we're going to intersperse with some readings, and then the idea is that slipping between all these cables, when the person who isn't reading, when someone's not reading, they'll sort of slide out of view. I sense bad things in our future.
It's going to be fine, John.
So Tracy,
yes,
we're going to interview each other as well.
sort of, yes.
Why trees?
Why trees? Why for me? Well, you know, I think that everybody has connections with trees mainly from their childhood. That's where it all starts. For me, the first tree I had interactions with was a beech tree in our backyard where I was growing up in Washington, D.C. And I have an older brother and sister, and we all they had learned to climb the tree. I wasn't quite high enough, tall enough to reach the branch I needed to reach to hoist myself up. And when I was 5 years old, I was finally able to. And once you get into a tree like that, you really get to know it in a way that is very intimate. It's very, you know, it's tangible, it's holding you up, you see out so much more. And I think I always think back to that tree still as the sort of touchstone, the tree that I actually touched, that you know stayed with me. And so when that was sort of my earliest recollection of trees. And then of course when I met you, you know a lot more about trees than I do. And I think some of it rubbed off on me. When we would go for walks, you would tell me about the beech tree having the roots book in different languages. And I learned a lot. And so it kind of seeped in to me. So that's why eventually I wanted it I wanted to use trees as characters for a book. What about you? Why are trees important to you?
Well, Tracy, I'm glad you asked that question. For me, it started with you know, my parents, as things often do. I grew up very near Kew Gardens, and in order to jolly us along, my brother and me, to keep us interested, my parents, particularly my dad, used to tell us stories about plants, many of them trees, and also feed us bits of them, which you know, always got interesting when it was things like opium poppies and so on. And you know, so I had this sort of association with trees, you know, all the way from childhood, and I think, you know, I was sort of looking for something to you know, that would combine history and folklore and science, which was the way that my father told us things about trees. And when I couldn't find such a thing, I thought, well, I'll try and write one. So that was my sort of background into trees. But we're going to start with The Edge of the Orchard. There it is.
Yes.
Probably most people on the call here have read it, but in case they haven't, do you want to say what it is and maybe
Sure.
sort of what prompted you to write this in particular?
Yeah, I Around the World in 80 Trees is not the one. At the Edge of the Orchard. Yes.
We become the same person.
Stealing his titles now. That's what happens when you're sitting on a sofa together. You mix up your books. At the Edge of the Orchard is set in the early 19th century, early to mid 19th century. And as you can hear, I'm American, and it's set in Ohio and then west to California. And it's about a pioneer family. It's about all those families that you heard of in the covered wagons moving west, and what they bring with them and why they bring it with them, and how far do you have to go to escape the things that happen to you. So it was why I wrote it is because I knew in the back of my mind I wanted to write a book that had trees as characters. And I was reading a book by a man named Michael Pollan called The Botany of Desire. And it has 4 sections in it about different plants: tulips, cannabis, potatoes, and apples. And I was reading the section about apples, all about Johnny Appleseed, who is an American folk hero. He was in the early 19th century. He paddled with his canoe all through the rivers and streams of Ohio and Indiana, spreading apples, apple trees, either in seed form or in sapling form that he had grown, to the settlers who needed them. And what I had always thought, had been always taught as a child, is that he was all about healthy eating and an apple a day keeps the doctor away, all of that. And actually the reality of botanically what was going on with him is he always grew apple trees from seed. Now, if you do that, 9 times out of 10, the apples will be what they called spitters in those days. Sour apples, which you can't eat, but you can use for making cider. And he didn't believe in grafting. He had religious beliefs that meant grafting was taking it away from God's business. It was God's business to do the trees, not people's. And I thought this was fascinating. So actually, what Michael Pollan talks about is he was selling, he's basically selling cider for people to get drunk. You know, he's selling trees for people to grow so that they could get cider, so that they could drink away their very, very difficult lives as pioneers in this difficult land. And I was so fascinated by this. I thought, I want to write about that. I want to write about those trees and this myth that we've grown up with. And what was Johnny Appleseed really like? And what were the trees really like? So I ended up writing about a family who settled in this area of Ohio called the Black Swamp, the Goodenough family. Pardon me. And it's all about trees. When you settle in Ohio, you have to plant 50 fruit, excuse me, 50 fruit trees in order to claim the land. They have to be 50 viable fruit trees within 3 years. And that was what Johnny Appleseed was promoting.
Shall I just take over for a minute while you're having a bit of a cough? I'll
Okay.
just while you're doing that, live television, folks.
I know.
I'll
Here's one I learned earlier.
yeah.
Actually, I'm fine now.
Oh, okay.
I'm fine now. So it's about this family who have to plant 50 apple trees and what happens to them. And that's one of the trees anyway that I write about. So that's my that's what the book is about.
And for me, as I mentioned, the kind of the reason for writing Around the World in 80 Trees and then Around the World in 80 Plants, many of which are trees in the second book, was because I wanted to find a book that combined plant science with culture, history, and folklore, and I couldn't really find exactly the thing that I wanted, so I wrote it. And choosing 80 species out of 60,000 or so tree species that there are was not the easiest thing.
So what was your criteria?
So my criteria were first of all to try to find stories that hadn't been told before, or that where at least some aspect would be surprising to at least some of the audience in each story. To make sure that the botanical stories were different, so it wouldn't all be conifers, wouldn't all be a fruit story or a seed dispersal story, and to make sure that lots of different parts of the world were represented. And that was why the oak tree wasn't in there. Everyone wonders why the oak tree wasn't in the book. It's because I couldn't really find anything interesting to say about it that hadn't already been said. And the reason that Leylandii represents England was because I thought that if ever there was a tree that summed up the English attitude to privacy and marking territory, that would be it. Now we're going to swap back to Tracy now, and I think you've got a reading for us. And what we're trying to do with these readings is sort of draw some of the parallels between the two books in terms of the themes that you mentioned at the outset.
Thank you.
I'm going to slip out of shot now, trying not to knock anything over.
Come back if I start coughing again.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to read a very short scene set in the Ohio Black Swamp area. the Goodenoughs are a family. James Goodenough is the father, and he is trying to plant these trees. And he's actually brought the trees, some of them from his family originally came from England, and they brought, in order to graft trees, if they had their favorite trees, and this is what this book really is about, is the trees moving with people. So people migrate, and so do plants and trees. So favorite apple trees, they would bring sticks over with them, branches, and they would over to, when they emigrated, and then they would graft them in America onto a rootstock and grow the trees there. So the Goodenoughs had been in Connecticut. They had brought trees from England, planted them there. From Connecticut, they brought the branches to Ohio, because, as you may know, trees are grafted, they're cloned. If you want the taste, the particular taste of a tree, you don't grow it from seed because it might be a spitter. If you want to grow it sweet, you graft it. And so James Goodenough is quite good at grafting. And this is a very short scene where he's grafting and talking about it with his son, Robert. Where do those golden pippins come from? James Goodenough quizzed his son. Connecticut. And before that? England. Your grandparents brought over branches of their favorite apple tree. Where in England? Robert Goodenough stared at his father with his unsettling eyes and shook his head. He was not the kind of boy to bluff if he didn't know. James was glad of his honesty. Herefordshire. Now, tomorrow we'll graft. Go and check the grafting clay. Make sure it hasn't dried out. If it needs it, add a little water and stir it in. Robert nodded. You know what you're looking for? You don't need me to check it with you? I'm all right, Pa. Robert trudged off towards the river, picking up a wooden bucket as he went. Most springs, James Goodenough grafted a few apple trees, turning spitters into eaters, or poor spitters into better spitters. In Connecticut, he had learned from his father how to make a productive tree from an indifferent one. And though he now had performed successful grafts dozens of times, he still appreciated the surprise of this recreation. Grafting had always seemed a miracle to James, that you could take the best part of one tree, its roots, say, bind it to the best part of another tree, one producing sweet apples, and create a third tree, strong and productive. It was a little like making a baby, he supposed, except that you had control over what characteristics you chose. His wife, Sadie, viewed grafting with suspicion, an attitude she had picked up from Johnny Appleseed. You ain't God, she liked to say, chopping and changing, making monsters. It ain't right. James noticed, though, that she still ate the apples from the grafted tree. Right.
So interesting sort of theme underlying there of genetic diversity, actually, and just how that's represented in apples. And increasingly, because many of our crops are so inbred, and we have a particular issue in apples because of the cloning that Tracy talked about, that in order to find the traits that we need, which may have been bred out over the years, but in particular, climate change resistance or resistance to drought, for example, which hasn't been needed for the last few hundred years. We're needing to turn to crop wild relatives, and the center of genetic diversity for apples is in Kazakhstan or sort of that region really of Eastern and Southeastern Asia.
Which is where they came from originally. I should have said that before.
Which I was just coming to.
Yeah, sorry.
And so that requirement of going back to where plants originally came from is very much current.
Can I just insert that what I also forgot to say was that really makes me laugh is there's the phrase American is apple pie, and apples actually did not originate in America. They're not American at all. They're from Kazakhstan and along the Silk Road to the Romans. The Romans brought them to England, and England brought them to the States. So now we know the real, everything's migrated. So nothing's pure. I love it. But Other things have migrated. You were going to do a reading, I think, about.
Yeah, I'm going to do a short reading about coffee.
Okay.
Actually, this is from 80 Plants, but the format is similar to 80 Trees, and I will do 80 Trees later. The little evergreen coffee tree began life somewhere near the forested mountains of southwestern Ethiopia, and its broad elliptical leaves with crinkled edges, shiny and dark above and pastel pale underneath, still prefer the shade. In full flower, coffee is a spellbinding but ephemeral joy. For just a couple of days, thousands of delicate white blossoms with a light fragrance of honeysuckle and jasmine can festoon a single tree. The smoothly oval fruits ripen to pillarbox red, their thin layer of edible flesh tastes of watermelon and apricot, and surrounds a pair of deeply grooved seeds that are the familiar coffee beans. More than 1,000 years ago, thanks to genius or good fortune, boringly unscented beans that had been separated from their fruit and husks were roasted, pounded, and added to hot water. The resulting fine-flavored, stimulating yet non-alcoholic brew spread via Yemen throughout the Islamic world and the Ottoman Empire. The story goes that in about 1600, coffee's association with Islam caused Vatican officials to dismiss it as Satan's latest trap to catch Christian souls. But Pope Clement VIII supposedly tried some and gave coffee his blessing because it would have been, quote, a shame to let infidels have sole use of it. What a charmer. Over the centuries, many cultures have developed coffee rituals sustained by beguiling paraphernalia and nerdy choices of grind and provenance. Ethiopia has a particularly elaborate ceremony. Amid wafts of incense, beans are freshly roasted over glowing charcoal and pounded at the table with cardamom or other spices. The resulting intense, dark drink is served with popcorn. It's a delightful experience for those fortunate enough to live within reach of an Ethiopian cafe, but perhaps not just before bedtime. Towards the end of the 19th century, Asian production of Arabica coffee was wiped out by a fungus, coffee leaf rust. Groves were replanted with Robusta, which was immune, and although it has a harsher taste than Arabica, it is now widely cultivated. Existing coffee strains are at risk once more from climate change and the new pests and diseases that come with it. But there is scope for breeding new varieties. There are more than 120 wild species of coffee, most of them in tropical Africa. They have fascinating flavors and contain differing amounts of caffeine, and some of them tolerate heat and drought or cope with different soils or plant diseases. Yet most are themselves threatened by climate change or forest loss. It feels unfair that much of the burden of protecting this vital wild source of genetic diversity for one of the world's most valuable commodities should be borne mainly by African nations. You can come back to the bench now.
Here.
So just emphasizing that importance really of genetic diversity and importance of wild relatives. Now, at the edge of the orchard isn't just about apples, but about redwoods and sequoias as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's their place in the story?
Well, I wanted two types of trees to anchor the two places in the book. So there's the Ohio apple trees, and then Robert, the young son, in what I read, ends up going west to flee family tragedy, and he ends up in California. And the other half of the book is about his time in California, where he meets plant collectors, particularly William Lobb, who is a well-known plant collector, who is the person who popularized the monkey puzzle tree, which both you and I hate that tree, but never mind. Lots of people love it.
They're all God's children.
Yeah.
I quite like it, but in its place. In fact, I love it in its place, which is sort of on a hillside in Chile rather than suburban Surbiton.
Yeah, but Lobb brought a lot of seeds and saplings back of monkey puzzle and all sorts. He went all up and down the west coast of South America and then the west coast of the United States. And I have Robert Goodenough meet him and end up working for him. And I wanted the tree to anchor that would be very Californian. And I actually thought of redwoods because of a place that you and I visited 30 years ago, and which is a Royal Forestry Society place, which Wendy mentioned earlier, which is the the Charles Ackers Grove in Wales, right along the Welsh border. And you and I were walking along Offa's Dyke when we first visited that grove. It's of 33 redwood trees. And they were planted in 1857 as part of an estate. But nobody really knows much about why the owner wanted them planted and what they were doing there, except that the Victorians had this craze for bringing in exotic plants like the monkey puzzle tree. And they started establishing pinetums, which are these coniferous arboreta that for collecting different exotic species. And redwoods and sequoias were part of that craze. And it was always in the back of my mind, who planted those? And I thought I would weave it into the book. So I'm going to read a brief passage when Robert Goodenough, who's an adult now, he's in California, and he comes across, he's heard there are these giant trees in this grove called Calaveras Grove, and they're sequoias, and he's never seen them. So he goes up, rides his horse up into the mountains to have a look at them. When Robert Goodenough arrived at the edge of Calaveras Grove, he dismounted and stood, hand on his horse's neck anchoring him. In his travels, he had seen many things that had given him an ache deep in his chest, like a splinter of sadness needling into his heart. Prairie that swept far out of sight, a tornado cycling across the gray-green horizon, snow-covered mountain tops that hung overhead like white triangles. Now he was seeing another. Two enormous trees stood on either side of the track, a natural entrance to the wood beyond. They were not as tall as redwoods Robert had seen on the coast, but they were much wider, as wide at their bases as a cabin. They dwarfed a person with their girth and the volume of wood they thrust towards the sky. If you stood far enough back to take in the whole of the trees, you didn't feel how enormous they were. If you came up close, though, you couldn't see their lowest branches. Robert left his horse and walked up the path, feeling as he did that he was shrinking into a speck beside the two trees. He put a hand on one to steady himself. The tawny red surface was spongy and thickly fissured, a fibrous bark that shed easily and turned into red dust Robert later found in his clothes and his hair, under his fingernails, in his saddlebags. The forest floor around the trees was thick and springy with thousands of years of rotting needles muffling his steps. And it was quiet, for there were no branches anywhere near him to rustle in the wind. Branches only started to grow from about 100 feet up, and the bulk of them were so high over his head that it strained his neck to look at them for long. Robert had no words for the odd, hollowed-out feeling that swelled inside him.
Just conscious of time, so I think that what we might do is just go straight on to your next reading about the Ackers Grove, and then I'll go on to the last one.
So I mentioned the Charles Ackers Grove, and I wanted to bring it in, and so I'm going to do a short reading at the end of the book. Since we don't know who or why exactly those 33 redwoods were planted on the Welsh border, I decided to make up a competition, which actually did happen from time to time. There were a number of plant hunters out in California and the upper Pacific Northwest, and they would race as much as one can, because it took months to get from the West Coast all the way to go down to Panama and across. There's no Panama Canal, so there's a train across and then up to get these plants to England and Scotland and Wales. And they used very ingenious things like this thing called a Ward's case, which was like a suitcase. It was like a mini tree house that had a mini glass house that would go on the deck of a ship. But a lot of these, the saplings would just end up being in buckets out on deck or below, and it was very difficult to get them across. So I imagined that since we have 33 managed to survive, that some of them didn't. So I said, the competition is that 50 have to be sent, 50 redwood saplings. And so Robert Goodenough goes, he's in San Francisco, and he goes outside of Oakland to I mean, it's all very small then, of course. So there was a redwood grove there. And he had to find 50 saplings for William Lobb to send on this competition. The redwood grove was full of tall trees with their distinctive auburn bark and needled branches getting bigger the higher up they grew. Robert knew he didn't have much time to collect 50 seedlings. Yet when he had walked a little way into the grove, he took a few minutes to sit on a log and look around. Last year's fire had charred parts of many of the trunks, but redwood bark was thick and full of tannin that protected it from burning, and redwood branches grew starting halfway up the trunk, which meant that flames couldn't use them as a ladder to reach the top of the tree. The forest floor had been cleaned by the fire, and now tiny seedlings were sprouting everywhere amid a carpet of emerald green redwood sorrel. Though not so big as the Calaveras sequoias he had been among weeks before, the redwoods gave him the familiar, soothing sense of being insignificant. If only I could keep this feeling with me everywhere I am, Robert thought. Maybe then it wouldn't be so hard to adjust to all the things that have happened to me. He spent a happy few hours finding seedlings and digging them up. As he worked, he wondered which trees would not survive the long journey across the ocean and what the rest would look like planted in foreign soil. Though it was not easy finding so many seedlings at one time, Robert did not hurry or worry, but worked steadily, ferrying what he dug up down to the larger road where William Lobb waited with the wagon. By sunset, he had dug up the 50th tree and tipped it into a pail. When he brought the last seedlings down to the wagon, William Lobb nodded, satisfied. "That'll do, lad. Good work."
So that brings us neatly onto biosecurity. I think we can all agree that here were these people like sending
Willy-nilly.
Sending material all over the world without a thought really at the time for what they might be for what might be coming with it, or how those species might become invasive or not. And of course, in terms of pests and diseases, there was a natural quarantine going on, which was on board ships in those Wardian cases or buckets. They a lot of the things that were most infested might actually have died en route. And it's one of the points that the Animal and Plant Health Agency now, part of DEFRA often make, is that, because we're ferrying stuff around at such speed, that's part of the problem. I'm just going to finish our bit with a little piece about a particularly misnamed tree called the Tree of Heaven, which really is the tree of hell. And maybe some of your members have views about this particular species. It's called Ailanthus altissima, or the Tree of Heaven, and I chose this one to represent Brooklyn in New York. The Tree of Heaven is at once cherished and despised. It gets its scientific name from the Moluccan ailantit, which roughly means tall as the sky. It can very quickly reach a height of more than 25 meters, with smooth, pale bark and, unusually for large broadleaves, an almost perfectly cylindrical trunk. The leaves are spectacularly big, several feet long, and made up from a couple of dozen smaller leaflets, giving it a distinctly tropical feel. The tree is native to China, but when its seed was introduced in 1820 in New York State, it impressed plant aficionados with its generous shade and unfamiliar ornamental quality. With what would later become a terrible irony, the seeds of this new arrival were even distributed by the US Department of Agriculture, after it had scoured Europe and Asia for sturdy plants that might be popular. Then, during the gold rush of the 1840s, Chinese miners brought seeds to plant as a source of traditional medicine, and apparently to remind them of home, where the tree was a common food for silk moths. By the mid-19th century, it had become common in nurseries across the eastern United States because it could be grown anywhere by even the least green-fingered. That should have been a warning. In summer, a female tree can produce 350,000 seeds, each one at the center of a samara, a wing of fibrous papery tissue which ripens from amber to crimson. They spin prettily as they fall, carry far on the slightest breeze, and can germinate just about anywhere. Easily colonizing disturbed land along railway lines or on building sites, The tree can cope with cement dust and noxious industrial fumes. Storing water in its root system, it is drought tolerant too, and will thrive where few others survive. That is why Betty Smith used the tree of heaven as a metaphor for immigrant life in her classic American novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, in which the titular sapling tenaciously makes a success in poor conditions, despite being underappreciated and struggling to reach the sky. As they say in Brooklyn, what's not to like? Actually, plenty. Ailanthus is not just tolerant of hardship, but also hugely invasive and practically indestructible. Most references concentrate on how to get rid of it. Cut it and the stump can resprout at a rate of about an inch a day, or an amazing 13 feet in a season. Burn or poison it, and the risk is that it will send out suckers, partly fed by the mother tree, that can regenerate on their own. Although the species rarely lives for more than 50 years, this suckering ability makes it possible for the tree to clone itself indefinitely. The bark causes contact dermatitis among tree surgeons, and the roots are forceful enough to damage underground sewers and pipes. Ailanthus even sees off competition by creating its own powerful herbicides, to which its own seedlings are immune. Growing like crazy, antisocial, and able to reproduce sexually at only 2 years old, the tree of heaven is often banned from cultivation. Even in China, where it is held in check by competitors and insects with which it has co-evolved, its reputation is such that a wayward child might be called a worthless ailanthus sprout. For some gardeners, however, it's a much maligned tree of surprisingly exotic splendor. There is truth in both views. As Betty Smith put it in the introduction to her story, it would be considered beautiful, but there are too many of it. So, two themes there. People moving plants and seeds all over the place, biosecurity issues all over the shop, and cloned material being vulnerable to disease and the need to return to wild relatives. Over to you.
Thank you, and fantastic timing. So thank you for that. Jonathan, I love the fact that every time you stood up, there was a lovely cushion of apples behind you. I don't know if that was specifically placed or not. So really a call to everyone to put in your questions in the Q&A, please. I'm about to start the questions and answers off. We'll start with Chris, and then I have some submitted questions. But for anyone else who's watching, please do put your questions in the Q&A and we'll come to you and we'll unmute you and you can ask them yourselves. So thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Jonathan and Tracy, for your run through of the two books and the beautiful way that you wove the two together, bringing up issues of genetic diversity and biosecurity, which when I read Tracy's book, I knew were in there, but those words didn't come into my head. But anyway,
nor did I.
Well, indeed. So yeah, my first question, actually, if I could address to Jonathan, please, is it's a fantastic book, beautifully written, but it's also beautifully illustrated. And I just wanted to just reflect on that. And could you just tell us a little bit more about how, is it Lucille Clerc?
Actually, if we can just share the screen. Do you mind? My charming assistant will share the screen.
Hopefully, there we go.
Just finding the screen to share. It's this one. Okay,
and then you just want to do that one.
Oh, beautiful.
Okay, so I mean, working with an illustrator is an interesting kind of job, really, because you have to make sure that the text and the pictures complement each other rather than repeat what's in them. And I suppose my background in television making helped me in that way, because you're used to sort of trying to not describe what's in the pictures, but have them complement each other. And she's done an amazing job. That's the birch. This one, it'll probably take a moment to load at your end, is the kauri, which is the wonderful resinous tree from New Zealand, which was the source of the resin that these prospectors in the picture used to dig up and make varnish out of for the empire, the wagons of the empire. And in the 1850s, 1860s, there was a resin rush to New Zealand in the way that there was a gold rush to California. There's the familiar beech tree. Lovely. I think she's captured the sort of spirit very well. And actually rather poignantly set in Kiev in the Ukraine. This is the horse chestnut, and you can just see the figures of the two kids playing conkers at the bottom. And here's the this is the Japanese lacquer tree, and two images there, and in fact the second image there is the front cover of the paperback of Around the World in 80 Trees. And there's the lovely banana. Madness, isn't it? I know that for real aficionados, the banana isn't technically a tree because it doesn't have a woody stem. Yeah, I know. I think of the banana as a tree. And there's the coffee that I was talking about earlier. We'll just stop the sharing now.
Yeah,
I'm back to
thank you. It really does just complement the words beautifully, I think, the way that that's been done. And can I just ask a question of Tracy now as well? So I love the bit about it was the kind of really funny bit, but also a bit sad, but where you describe Calaveras Grove, and it's already sort of been turned into a theme park. And they've got one of the trees has been taken down, and they turned it into a dance floor. And I was thinking, for instance, this is 1850 or something. Yeah. I mean, could you just tell us a little bit more about the story of how, the sort of tourism sort of quickly came on the back of
it was really shocking when I was doing the research on it to discover that Calaveras Grove was sort of discovered by white people because, of course, Native Americans had known about it for centuries. It's a grove of, I think, 100 sequoias up in a certain part of California at a certain elevation, which is the elevation where sequoias grow. And it was discovered, I think, in 1852 by a man who had been was being chased by a bear, and he ran into this grove and found it. And these two brothers immediately claimed it as theirs, and they began to promote it as a tourist attraction. And they thought, we have to do more than just have these huge trees. And if you've ever seen huge trees like that, it is quite hard to tell how wide across they are. So what did they do? They cut one down, and they used the stump as a dance floor. So they would have dances up there, and they built a hotel, and they used the long trunk as a bowling alley. So, it wasn't enough just to admire these incredible trees, but they had to mess around with them too. I mean, I admit, because I went there, of course, to do research, and the dance floor is now, you can walk up on it. And it is quite amazing, because when you walk up to the trees, and when I was describing Robert seeing them for the first time, what I noticed in the grove was that everybody walks up to them, looks up to see how high they are, and they get a little unsteady. So they always put their hand against the tree. Everybody did that, including myself. And so sometimes it's only when you actually go to a place and do the thing that your character is going to do that you pick up those little details, like the duff on the floor, which is of the around the trees. It's thousands of years or 1,000 years of needles makes it spongy in a certain way. And also that dust, that red dust that I mentioned, he finds in his hair and his saddlebag. I found it in myself too. And those are things that you would just never know unless, that's why you have to do your research if you're writing, because you never know what you're going to come up with otherwise.
Okay, thank you. That's really great. Just a bit extra detail there. So should we go to one of our questions now? So I think, should we go to Richard Gulliver, who's got a question?
Oh, well, it wasn't a question. It was just an observation that when I was a boy, possibly 10 or so, there was a British comic that ran week on week, The Adventures of Johnny Appleseed.
What, in England?
In England, yes. I can't remember the name of the comic. I actually didn't have the comic. I read it at Friends, but it must be possible somehow to trace it back. It was black and white, line drawings. And there he was with his canoe and his bag, leather pouch or some such, perhaps cloth, in his hand, going around distributing the seeds and distributing the young trees.
I love it. I had no idea. I will definitely seek that out. Thank you.
We need to find out. I used to get the Beano. I don't think it was in the.
No, it wasn't that. No.
Okay, well, thank you, Richard. That's a great contribution. So it's maybe it's been over. Johnny Appleseed has been in UK consciousness maybe a bit longer than we realised.
Yeah.
So
shall I go to one of our submitted questions now? This again, sorry, this is for you, Tracy. So you've talked about the apple trees coming over from England. I imagine they came from elsewhere as well. But the question here is, were there other species like peach and other trees associated with different settlers and different areas of America?
That's a very good question, and I'm not going to try to answer it without knowing. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure for sure there was a commerce in plants and trees going back and forth. It was apple trees that I focused on, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I'm just wondering where peaches came from. I mean, were they native to Georgia? I don't know. Do you know?
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan.
All those sort of plums and wonderful things that yeah, came from originally from that area. But you know, I think that the immigrant communities to the United States brought a lot of things with them that would both remind them of home and also feed them. I mean, famously, people brought their sourdough, didn't they? And you know, and sort of yeast mixtures. But the you know, I think there are plenty of things that are definitely not native to the United States, which are grown there, which people would have brought in various waves of immigration.
I think that's one of the things I was really focusing on in the book, was this idea of there being almost like a circle of migration. So the apple trees are coming from England, and then you go across the states and the redwoods go back to UK. So there's this kind of circle, but things move around. I mean, it's amazing when you look at your own garden, the stuff that has come, nasturtiums have come from elsewhere, begonias have come from elsewhere. Ground elder was brought over by the Romans, I think you told me, and they used to eat it. And I was just thinking when you read about the tree of heaven, how a little bit of it is fine, like a little bit of ground elder is fine, but ground elder just totally takes over and it's not so fine. So there's always that, or you know, Japanese knotweed. Why did that come over? These things that are invasive, that seem invasive now, are actually brought over for a reason. The time.
Often, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to another one of our delegates today. So there's a question from Janet Shepherd. Can we get Janet to ask her question? Or
Hi, Janet.
Hi, I'd like to ask Tracy why you chose the golden pippin as the apple that the settlers brought over from England.
Yes. Oh yeah. What was a good? I wanted it to come from Herefordshire, which is not too far from. I wanted to originate in Herefordshire, which is not too far from the Charles Acker's Grove. It's not exactly, but it's not far in the great scheme of things. So I wanted to like complete that circle.
Okay.
And I was looking for an apple that was really unusual and had a very, very unusual flavor. And the Pitmanston pineapple, which is what the golden comes from, the golden pippin, it has this pineapple finish, and they're very small. People don't tend to grow them very much because they're small and they fruit quite late. But when you do get one, I finally managed to taste them, and they do have this wonderfully interesting finish. So I wanted something that was really unique to the apple world.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Janet. Can I just chip in with? I've got a question for Jonathan. I was really fascinated with the. I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, but the Seve Bleu, which is this tree that sort of can cleanse contaminated land, which just sounds. It's like there's no end to what trees can do. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean the Seve Bleu, which basically means sort of blue sap, I think. Is a tree that's native to New Caledonia, which is the sort of in the South Sea Islands, you know, sort of quite near. I was going to say quite near to New Zealand, but it's probably about 1,000 miles actually. It's near on my globe. And the thing about that area of New Caledonia is that there is a lot of naturally occurring nickel in the soil. It's where it's one of the principal sources of nickel for the world, which we use for batteries and all sorts of other things, stainless steel. And the plants that have evolved with that level of nickel in the soil have had to kind of find ways of not being poisoned, essentially, have had to evolve that. And the way that the Sève Bleue has managed to do this is by sequestering the dangerous nickel that it takes up through its roots in sort of special cavities, really, within the stems. And so if you cut into a Sève Bleue, you get this sort of bright blue, turquoise blue sap, which is extraordinarily heavy because it really has a lot of nickel in it. So one tree can have 30 kilos of nickel in it, and it's actually still more cost effective for them to just open cast mine rather than plant a load of trees and extract the nickel from them, which is sad. But this kind of quality that certain plants have for being able to take up certain chemicals is also the means for something called phytoremediation, which is where you use plants to sort of effectively purify or make useful contaminated land. And what you can do is you plant certain things, that are particularly effective at taking up the thing that you want to get rid of. You then take those, harvest those plants and ideally don't dump them somewhere bad, but treat them and either extract, and preferably extract that chemical. So, but that's sort of the Sève Bleue is a sort of really brilliant example of that happening.
Yeah, just incredible.
Can I take people to John Brown, who has an observation, one for you, I think, Jonathan, here. He says, not a question, but a comment, John, which is that a banana is certainly tree-like with its fibrous trunk. It's technically a monocotyledonous species, or monocot for short. I'll go for that one. And I suggest it should be equally worthy of the status tree, given broadleaves are dicots and conifers are multicots.
John, I couldn't agree with you more. There are pedants in the world who will just sort of say that it's not a tree, and for the book I had to acknowledge that, but on the other hand, it's gone in as a tree.
John, if you were here, John would take you to the pub and discuss this further.
I also have to say, in Around the World in 80 Plants, I also included phytoplankton, which may not be, these are marine plankton, and they may not be everyone's idea of a plant, but I decided that something can qualify as a plant if it photosynthesizes, and they certainly do a lot of that.
Okay. Let's go to Peter Schweiger. Hello, Peter.
Well, I mean, the obvious question is, tell us about oak apples.
Oak apples. I feel that you have a particular interest in oak apples.
Is that a rhetorical question, Peter?
Well, it was your interest in oak trees and apples, you see. I mean, it has to go together.
You're saying we should write a book together, really, I think is what you're saying, about oak apples. What do you think, John?
Now, by oak apples, do you mean oak galls?
Yes.
Yeah, so that a tree's way of defending itself sometimes against little gall wasps that come and want to lay their eggs in the bark or just underneath, is that they surround the sort of infection, I suppose, that they regard it as, with tissue that sort of isolates that bit of the tree. And in the case of galls, you often get quite a sort of a large structure around the thing that it's trying to isolate. And so this is in effect what the Sève Bleue that I described was doing. It's sort of isolating the thing that's dangerous or difficult or might attack the tree. And trees are fantastically good at this. So where there's an infection, often the tree will just isolate that bit of the wood and carry on living quite happily. Or occasionally trees will even drop a limb But in the case of gall wasps, they sort of isolate what the tree regards as something it doesn't want by this sort of layer. And those galls often make very interesting kind of timber. So people make really interesting kind of bowls and things out of large, the cross section of large galls. And Rembrandt used gall to make the ink that he used for some of his drawings. The gall can sometimes contain pigments, which are rather interesting. Peter, I don't know if you wanted to add any more to that.
What about the oak apples?
Yeah.
Not really, but I did have another question. I did want to have a look at the books, you see, and I clicked on the link for Lawrence King, and it didn't seem to open up. Or when I did get there, there were so many.
All right, Peter, here's the thing to do. Type in my surname, Drori, and Around the World in 80 Trees or Around the World in 80 Plants, and you'll find them. And if you want to look at Amazon or something, then that will immediately come up. Whether or not you buy them at Amazon, that's your own choice. You might want to go to an independent bookshop. But I promise you, if you type in my surname and the title of the book into Amazon, then you'll get the picture come up.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Just I can just go back to one of the comments. So John, who was asking the question about bananas, he says he's up for a drink in the pub, and he actually lives near the Redwoods. So next time you're over in that area, you might find him in one of the pubs.
Thank you, John. And in fact, I wanted to say that we were lucky enough to 30 years after we had visited them the first time. This past January, we were at the Charles Ackers Grove with Wendy and for a country file on Radio 4. And I don't know if you look on BBC Sounds, it might still be on, but it was really wonderful to see those trees again after all this time, and 30 years bigger as well. And it's still as magical a place as ever. So I highly recommend it if you can ever visit. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you both. Or thank you, everybody. We've hit time scales now. I think it's been really, really interesting. I've loved it. I just a sort of final roundup from the two of you. What projects have you got on next? Because I know, Jonathan, you've done Around the World in 80 Plants, and there must still be more trees you'd want to write about. Tracy, what's your next big?
Well, I'm still considering exactly what my next thing is. I'm hoping that there might actually be a series of children's books coming out, because while I was thinking about what to do as the next big thing, I thought writing something short for kids might be a nice thing to do. So I'm hoping that happens. And I'm busy with the various boards and so on that I'm on, various organizations and so on.
And I'm just now editing a novel about Venetian glass. And, Venice is really wonderful. The problem with it doesn't have many trees. And whenever I'm there, I love being there. I love that there are no cars, but it's the trees I miss. So I'm sad to say there are no trees in the book, although, as John taught me, the Venice was built on alder piles pounded into the mud, and millions of them down there. So that's it's probably called The Bead Maker, although who never knows? We never know, the title might change, but with any luck, it'll be out next September.
I shall really look forward to that one personally.
You often hear, when you walk around Venice or you're on a gondola, you often hear people remarking on the lack of treescape that it exhibits, don't you? So, okay.
The one thing I did learn was gondolas are made from 20 different types of wood. 20.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow, okay, well, there you go. What a killer fact to end on. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us this evening. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for our book club. And just a reminder, so our next book club will be in the new year with Professor Julian Evans, who's a keen Wales supporter, so he's probably watching the football this evening. And the book's God's Trees, Trees, Forests and Wood in the Bible, another fascinating book club to look forward to. But it's now just time to say good night to everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.